The eve of Canada Day. The audience might not be here, right? But thank you for coming. As you can see, this is the title is adjusted to this lecture, but probably will not be this title when we finish it. It's a research that I'm co-authoring with Dilanit Parikovsky, a friend and colleague from the Tel Aviv University, and also a postdoc at the Hebrew University this year. I want to start by saying that this is, as you actually mentioned the very end, it's not very known, this story. So there's not too much research or data that we could have collected. I mean, not too many archival material that was available to us. And we're still working on aspects of this. And this is also the first time that I'm presenting this research. So I hope to be coherent, but there is still work to do here. So bear with me, and if you have any comments, please do. One thing I do want to say is that the space agency, the Israel Space Agency, is part of the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Space. But its origins were in the defense realm, in the defense ministry, in the IDF itself. So this perhaps can explain why some of the data we will not be able to see for quite a while, because it's in the military archives, actually, not in the state archives, which are usually a bit more liberal in their release of material. But again, this was all done quite quietly, secretly. So at that time, and only later it became public once an official agency was established. Then it became public that Israel actually has serious aspirations. Now this is interesting. I will get to that later. But this is interesting because Israel, when it went into space, when it launched its first satellite in September 1988, it was only the 8th country in the world to do that with its own means. I mean, it's rocket from its own territory, its own satellite, and so on and so on. This is something that is usually larger countries do. Great powers, actually. Only great powers before Israel. Also, at that point, well, it wasn't great power then, but now perhaps you would refer to as a semi-great power. India came before Israel, but Israel was number 8 to go into space, which is quite a remarkable achievement. Okay, a bit of history about. I hope you can see the. I'm sorry that it's a bit small, but it's only a bullet points. A bit of history of how we got to 1981. Actually, this last Sunday marked that meeting when Begin approved 35 years since Begin approved the program, and the specific date is not really significant, but it's still relevant to know. So, in 1961, in July 61, Israel launched the Shavit 2 rocket. That was in response to the Egyptian ballistic effort with the German scientists. But it was only Israel's beginning of reaching up into space. Ben Gurion, then Prime Minister and Defense Minister, he was at the launching site in Palmachim, and he told a journalist that this was a scientific achievement for Israel. He actually denied the security aspect of the launch, but it wasn't true. I mean, there was definitely the security issue. I mean, trying to counterbalance actually the Egyptian progress as Israel saw it at that time. It was very relevant. And then also in the academia, in the Israeli academia, there was a beginning of talking of a space agency, but it never really emerged into a government agency, with all of the mobility abilities that a government has. So it was more research but not much more than that. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, shock in many aspects, but also in the intelligence community, not only the surprise itself, but also in the incapability to have good reconnaissance material, timely material about Egypt and Syria during the war, because Israel needed to rely on American satellite images, which sometimes they gave, sometimes they didn't give, sometimes they blurred it a bit or didn't give the best resolution that Israel was expecting. So Israel understood that it had a problem here that it needed to solve. Now, so the military intelligence was actually very much in favor of going into space eventually. It knew that, of course, it had the capabilities were, Israel's capabilities to launch into space were progressing. Actually, the Shavit 2, when it was launched, the scientists said that within 20 years we can actually go into space, which was exactly what happened. I mean, it's a coincidence that it happened under Begin at that point. So, the new head of intelligence, military intelligence, Shlomo Gazit, General Shlomo Gazit, he was the first one to really push the issue forward. Then he was replaced by Yoshua Sagi, who continued. He also supported the idea of establishing a space program, and they tried to sell it up to their superiors. Yoshua Sagi in 1979, before I get to that, I just mentioned here that in the mid-1970s, Yuval Ne'eman, Professor Yuval Ne'eman, then from the Tel Aviv University, who later became a politician, and he actually was the one behind the space agency, the government space agency, as the Minister of Science under Begin in his second term after 1981. Yuval Ne'eman he in the mid-1970s was the scientific aide of Defense Minister Shimon Peres, and he tried to push forward, starting this program, going to space. And Prime Minister at that time, Rabin, said no. Why? Let's get back to that perhaps later. But the really short answer is because Yuval Ne'eman was Shimon Peres' aide. So immediately you say no, because at that time their rivalry was any position one takes, the other takes the other position immediately, because that's how it worked between them for 20 years. So that was under Rabin in the mid-1970s. And then 1977, Menachem Begin comes to power after the elections, and quite quickly he starts the peace process with Egypt, which was concluded with a peace treaty in March 1979. 1979, at that time, Yoshua Sagi, again, he's chief of intelligence. He went with this program that he's suggesting at that point to Rafael Eitan, the chief of staff, and to Defense Minister Ezer Weizmann. Explains why. I will explain why. What he was explaining to them, what the whole logic was, but they rejected it. They said no. But he decided to continue working on this, until you get the right answer. So you continue working on it, but quietly. Yeah, no, it's not Ne'eman. I mean, he probably was involved one way or another, but this is Yoshua Sagi, the head of intelligence, General Sagi. So he was the experts within the IDF started feasibility studies on the production of launch vehicles and satellites. This was completed by December 1980, and they found out that it could happen now, I mean at that point, and they decided to push it onwards into the defense ministry. Well, luckily, perhaps, I mean for the program, in May 1980, while the feasibility studies were still ongoing, Ezer Weizmann resigned from his position, and Menachem Begin, the prime minister, decided that he's taking the defense portfolio until the next elections. I mean, the other alternative would have been to give it to Ariel Sharon, and Begin at that point was strong enough to say no, for many reasons. So he became defense minister, which means that there is one less level to go to, right? This is why you can talk, when they talked with Begin, they talked with the prime minister and the defense minister at the same time. One less meeting. Okay. And at the end of June 1981, just 3 weeks after Israel successfully destroyed the Osirak reactor near Baghdad, and just 4 days before the 1981 elections, by the way, today is the 35th anniversary of those elections, the initial concept was introduced to Begin. Begin approved the project immediately and instructed that the development should begin immediately, even though there was no secure funding yet. But let's start. So why? What happened? I mean, why was he so eager to start? Well, the short answer is security. It's also the correct one, but not full. This is not the complete answer for the reason. The 1981 elections, the polls showed that Begin was about to be defeated. Peres was on the rise this time, after so many problems with the Begin government, except for the peace process. Actually, there were many problems within the government and in the country. People thought that Peres would win, and Begin, just 3 weeks before the elections, ordered to strike Osirak. People later accused that Begin did it for election reasons, which means that he did it to boost himself towards the elections. Later, his aides said, no, the elections were a consideration, but other way around. He assumed that he's going to lose. He knew that Shimon Peres was against striking. He thought that striking was so important that he must do it before the elections, before he loses power. It just happened that that gave him the boost to actually win. Believe whatever you want. I'm not going to get into that. But the point is that elections were in one way or another relevant to that, and the calculation that I might not be here after the elections to make decisions was relevant to Osirak, but also perhaps to dealing with the space program. Now, the Israeli scientific community was able by 1981 to launch an indigenous space program, which includes everything, as I said, building the devices and launching them into space on locally constructed rockets and from Israel itself. The maturity coincided with Begin's term in power. He was just there, actually. He made the decision once he was assured that the Israeli industry and scientific community can make it happen. Now, this is important to have all of these elements in your possession. Okay, if you can construct a satellite and launch it from another country, that's one thing. If you can do it from your own country with your own rocket, that's something very different, and this is where you actually need a government program, okay, government sponsored program. And this program just luckily benefited, I mean, it came to be due to regional development that Israel was at its center, at their center. Namely the peace treaty with Egypt, and also, as I said, Osirak. But Egypt was the most important issue. How come? Because suddenly it happened that Israel understood that, or became aware that it needed more intelligence gathering capabilities while it was withdrawing from Sinai. I'm looking at the map of Israel there. It's behind your wall, sorry, you can't see it. Just imagine. Israel without Sinai doesn't have a buffer zone. Sinai was a buffer zone, right? Most of the Egyptian army, actually all of it, is beyond Sinai, right? It's within Egypt itself. But while Israel was controlling Sinai, it could have sent reconnaissance flights almost to the canal, to the Suez Canal, and observe what is happening in Egypt, okay? It was about to lose all of that. This is why it became acute, if not urgent, to find another solution. And that other solution was going to the space. Okay. At that point, when Begin approved this program, there were lots of projects, actually, which lay heavy burden on Israel's budget. Maybe that can explain part of why Israel's economy actually collapsed a few years later.
I was going to ask you that about it, whether finances weren't an issue.
Yeah, it's an issue. It's always an issue. But in this case,
and this is like a major financial.
it is. Yeah. So I'll just say what was on the table at that time. From the mid 1970s, you had the Merkava tank, and then in the late 1970s, actually 1980, Ezer Weizmann, as defense minister, he launched the Lavi project, the Stryker aircraft, which means that was at that point. It was said that this was the heaviest economic burden that Israel ever took on itself. This later was shut down by the unity government in 1987 because of the budget issues. But they started at that point. And the space program was perhaps visionary in a way, but without a budget, without a secure budget at that time. Later, there's a point where Yoshua Sagi testifies that Begin asked immediately in that meeting in late June 81, he's asking how much would it cost? And the IDF told him, and he said, Begin says, I see you're saying 150 million, I guess lirot or shekel at that point. He said, well, I know you're old for 4 years, it's probably 300, but still, you need to find some margin here, right? And don't forget, again, getting back to the peace with Egypt, you are withdrawing. Israel is withdrawing gradually, so it's not in one phase. Every time you withdraw, you need to stabilize your new line, perhaps construct new roads. When you get to the end, to the final withdrawal, you also need to rehouse the settlers. It's not too many, but still you need to take care of them. It's a heavy burden. Now, Aaron Beit Lachmi, who was the Director General of the Ministry of Defense under Ariel Sharon, he was actually asked by my co-author about this, wasn't it too heavy a burden? He said, no, actually, this is something Israel did what it could do, whatever it could maintain at that point. But I don't have all of the details of how exactly they did it, but you shouldn't assume that after the Yom Kippur War, the budget for the military rose dramatically in Israel. This is part of why Israel's economy a decade later collapsed. This is why, under the unity government, Rabin in 1985 came up, as a defense minister, with cutting very deeply into the military budget because it was the good of the country. You just couldn't maintain such a huge army anymore. But at that point, it did seem to them, at least in the early 1980s, that they could maintain all of these projects simultaneously. Now, okay, so this brings us here. I have mentioned part of these issues. One point that is perhaps more theoretical that I want to mention here is the term securitization, which means making something into a security issue, very broadly. The idea is that you take a project, say, going into space can be a scientific issue, right? Most countries would assume that it's for scientific reasons that you would want to go into space. In Israel's case, you make it a security issue, not only, of course, space, anything. You make it into a security issue, it immediately raises the antennas, right, of the politicians, and they start understanding what you're talking about. I mean, just think of if the scientific community would have tried to sell this to any politician, never mind who the prime minister is, and none of them were scientists, right? None of them. As a scientific issue, it wouldn't have sold. But once you make it security up, I understand what you're talking about. So this is, again, you're making the science, the kind of scientific achievement of going into space a security issue, and the security issue is real. You need the reconnaissance over Egypt. Okay? Don't forget, it's the first time Israel is making peace with an Arab state. It's the most powerful state. It's just, what, 6 years after the Yom Kippur War? It's the same president. Can you really trust him or not? How do you make sure that Egypt, under his rule, is keeping their promise? What happens after him? This is something that Begin rose to Carter many times. What happens after Sadat? I mean, he's a dictator. He's an authoritarian ruler. What happens after? Who said it would be Mubarak? Who would replace him? Whatever, however his regime ends. What happens next? So there's lots of uncertainty there, right? And still Israel is withdrawing from its most important buffer zone. So this is why it became really urgent, I would say, to go into space. Now, in 1980, as I mentioned, Weizmann resigned. Peace was already established. Israel started withdrawing. Weizmann resigned. Yoshua Sagi goes again to his superiors. This time to deputy minister of defense at that time, Mordechai Tzipori. He was under Weizmann and remained under Begin. And he sold the idea. And he said, okay, but let's see the feasibility before we go to Begin. That happened by the late 1980, and then the meeting was scheduled for June. And then, again, as you see, you have a prime minister who's also the defense minister, but this whole discussion is done within the Ministry of Defense. Okay? It's not a government decision. And by the way, immediately after the elections, Ariel Sharon becomes the defense minister. It's about 6 weeks or so after Begin approved the initial, gave the initial approval, and it was introduced to Sharon, and Sharon immediately said yes, continue. Would he have done it without Begin's previous approval? We can't know. Now, I do have, okay, this is a peace treaty, just to remind the baseline. This is the region to monitor, right? Sinai. This is in nighttime. You can see where Egypt really is. I can't see anything. It's the delta, okay, that's Egypt. And Israel is over there. Of course, this is a modern photo. Okay. Now,
people in the back, can you see that screen?
Yes.
You can see it back there?
Yes, good.
Okay.
okay, that is said. Now, so what I'm trying to say here that telling Begin that Israel had the capability, he didn't know that Israel, perhaps he didn't know at that time that Israel actually had the capability to go into space. But telling him that, and that can solve the intelligence gap, that made the sell for him. Immediately. It seems that immediately he accepted. Again, I said we have a gap here of perhaps documentation. We don't know if he was prepared, how well he was prepared for this discussion. if at all. But it does seem that immediately on that in that meeting, he understood what was going on, and he understood the potential advantage that it will have by going to space. That had a negative aspect also, which I'll get to a bit later. This is why he said, let's start immediately. Now, this is where also you have another scene. I mean, if you think that the whole problem is monitoring Egypt, well, of course not, because in those years, Iraq was going for its nuclear program. Everyone knew about it. Israel at first was trying to stop it diplomatically, but once that failed, they went to the military option. But that means that this is the region that you need to look, all of the Middle East. Okay, so again, going to space actually has lots of logic for security reasons. You need cameras, okay, in space. And also the strikers that went to Osirak didn't have the most recent photos of the facility. Again, because Israel understood that it can't trust completely the United States as much as it would want. Okay. So Israel needed a broader coverage of the region, and but one thing is important here: the fact that Begin approved launching the space program does not mean that Israel can launch anything. Okay, there is a gap of several years before something will be launched. That happened 7 years later, which might be actually quite quick. That within 7 years Israel launched a satellite into space. But this is a gap that was perhaps, you can call it a leap of faith. You can say, well, it's a given. There's nothing to do at that point, right? Until you actually start seeing results. The first two satellites actually were not carrying any cameras, from what I know. They were just like a test to show the capability. Only 1995, Israel launched its first Ofek 3, it was called, because the series is called Ofek 1 and 2 were the first one, and then came Ofek 3 with a camera on it. I mean, you can find it on Wikipedia, I'm not telling you any secrets here. That was actually those cameras bested their developers' expectations, and it did very well. And since then, you have the Ofek series, which is for reconnaissance issues. You have also later came Amos and Eros, which are more civilian. Okay, so actually Israel is not only focused on military issues. It started expanding into technology, into actually scientific issues and communications. But the most important thing that we're talking here about is the military one, because this is what Begin had in mind when he said yes at that point, because this is what he was sold.